Welcome back to another episode of Café con Chisme. I'm Yaz.
And I'm Seb.
And we are very excited to be bringing you a very special episode today. We have a special guest with us. Welcome.
This is Victor. Go, everyone. Welcome. This is a special, and then we're going to have you introduce yourself in just a second, Victor. But I wanted to to the folks listening, this is a special episode. We thought we would do an episode to kind of center around what it means to be non-binary. I think I've said it on the show before. I identify that way. Victor identifies that way, and they're a close friend. And so Yaz is going to be moderating the conversation today because while we do talk about, I think, queer and trans issues on the show, I don't think we've ever had like a central, like, especially one on non-binary identities and experiences. And so that's what we're here to do today. That's the episode. So Victor, if you want to like tell the folks a little bit about yourself before we get started.
I am non-binary, transgender, trans femme, gender fluid, all of the things. I consider myself to be a little bit of an extraterrestrial just planted on this planet, and I'm figuring out what this human life is like. So that has led me to being a community organizer. I have an organization here in Los Angeles for trans and queer, Black, Indigenous, POC people called Space Makers. And it's all centered around connecting queer and trans people of color and understanding our experience. So that's really where my passion is. And I've been very inspired by Seb as well. And we met kind of through one of their storytelling experiences that I really was honored to be a part of and see. And in those moments of seeing Seb tell their story in that narrative really led me to identifying more of my gender identity and coming to terms that I was non-binary, literally the moment that I saw Seb on the stage. So we've been friends since then and have lots of conversations about being Chicanx and Latinx and non-binary and queer and how all of those things kind of correlate and interconnect. So it's really exciting to now be here with Yaz as well and be able to talk about those things here.
I know, like full circle, right? Because that was like a little over a year ago, right before I moved to Boston. Yeah, we did Mi Primo en Marica with Ernesto, and I think I knew of you because of David, but I don't think we had ever met until that day. And then the conversations we had afterward, I was always like, I think the first time we met after that, when I was home one time, like we just had like a long conversation about all of these, about gender and some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, actually. And I remember, and I don't know if I remember if I told you that night, but afterwards I was just like, we have to do, like, I wanted to do something after that. Cause it's like, I have other non-binary friends, very close friends in my life. But I just had never had like that, like, when you're clicking, when you're like, yes, this is exactly what I've been struggling with or kind of navigating on my own, and hadn't really like had words to put to it until you talked about it with somebody else. So in that same vein, like, I appreciate you for that, because I feel like I've been able to kind of like explore more of that in the conversations you and I have had. So I'm so excited you're here, and welcome.
Hey.
Awesome. So thank you both for allowing me to moderate this conversation. Obviously, my role in this conversation will be a little different than some of our episodes in the past, but I think that's very important, and I'm excited for the conversation to begin. So if both of you are okay, we can just go ahead and jump on in.
Let's do it.
Okay, awesome. So to begin this conversation, I think the three of us kind of agreed that it would be important to kind of go over like a glossary, right, of some of the terms that are going to be used in the conversation, and to kind of allow folks that are listening to get a better understanding. And so we can start right at the beginning, right? When we talk about gender nonconforming or non-binary, how would either of you describe that, or what does that mean?
I'm gonna let you go first, Victor, since you're the guest.
Oh, thank you. When we're describing gender non-conforming and non-binary people, for me, what it means, and for I believe a lot of non-binary people, is that it's different from two hard binaries, which is what everyone is familiar with, male and female, and any of the space that's in between can be considered non-binary. Some people feel more male than female, some people feel neither and feel somewhere in the middle. Some people really vary every single day as they're figuring out what gender means to them. So when we speak about it, non-conforming people means they don't conform to binary standards of their expression, usually how they look or ideas they subscribe to. So when we speak about it, we're talking about people who exist within that space who are constantly challenging what binary genders mean, which are really the dictators of our society right now.
Yeah, definitely. And I think oftentimes, like, when folks think of gender or gender identity, they often conflate like sex and gender identity. So if this is new terminology to you, the differences really are, so sex literally refers to like anatomy, like what body parts do you have right between your legs, and where gender is more of how you express, I mean, how you see yourself in your gender, right? So it's not tied to biology necessarily. It's not tied to, you know, whatever identity you're assigned at birth. And when we talk about, you know, gender being a social construct similar to race and sexuality, what that means is that kind of what Victor was saying, right? All the knowledge that we have of how gender looks today is because we've been socialized to believe that, right? I think we were talking with my mom the other night that Sears invented boys liking blue and girls liking pink, like in the 50s, right? Or around that time. And so, you know, everything from how kids are socialized with what toys they're allowed to play with, which we're going to get into also a little bit later, to what colors they're supposed to like, or what kind of types of play activities or whatever they're engaged in. Those are all things that are arbitrary, right? That we have just kind of said, this is what boys do and what girls do. And then the other kind of part of that is gender expression, right? So how you choose to express that gender, right? So just because you identify as non-binary, I think oftentimes there's an assumption that you're going to like present yourself as androgynous or like gender bending, or, you know, like, and that can very well be the case, and it also cannot. And then like neither one of them is more or less, you know, authentically non-binary. But I think there's a kind of misconception with that. And then so that gender, sex, gender identity, and then gender expression. And all of those two are also different than sexuality, which refers to desire, right? Who are you attracted to? Who turns you on? And desire being romantic desire, sexual desire. And I would even argue like platonic desire, right? Like, or if that makes sense, but like the kind of people you're attracted to that might not necessarily be romantic or sexual, but it could also, you know, like kind of blurring those lines. So yes. And I think there's two more things, like terms I think we need to also clarify for folks, is that we'll probably say a lot, is cisgender and transgender. So if you haven't heard the word cisgender, or just cis, which is CIS, right? It refers to folks who do identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. So if you were assigned a boy at birth and you have a penis and you identify as male, then you would be a cisgender person. And I think
for example, myself.
Yeah, so yes, a cisgender woman, right? She's cis. And she's also my cis.
Oh, okay. So we're bringing the dad jokes early on.
You know what? It's the Thea jokes first, and I'm running on a little seat. So you're going to get my awkwardness today. Yeah, and then I think the last thing to say about cis is also that it's used to not mark trans as other, right? So a lot of times people say like, oh, trans is like the other type of gender as opposed to what people call normal or standard. And so I think cis is just a way of almost equalizing how we talk about trans and cis people. I'll stop there.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So when we're talking about gender nonconforming folks, and the conversation of pronouns comes up, and people often, well, not a lot of people, but some people that are just committed to misunderstanding often find a hard time with folks that have chosen the they pronoun. right? They, them, theirs. What can we talk about with pronouns? So why are they so important? What happens if you mess up? And how does one have good practice when it comes to pronouns?
You want to go? Yeah.
Pronouns is a very important part of I believe, the first identifiers for a lot of trans people and non-binary people. Again, some people who are non-binary identify as trans, and some people who are non-binary do not identify as trans. So as we talk about pronouns, it's how somebody identifies themselves. So it's more of a practice of if you're introducing yourself as a cis person, it's saying, my name is Yaz and my pronouns are she, her. This is because a lot of trans people are still early in stages of recognizing or don't feel safe or comfortable yet to say their pronouns, but to establish a kind of cadence where everybody is making it normal to say what their pronouns are, I feel is the best approach. I feel comfortable saying my pronouns are they, them, because where I am in my experience and my expression is that I feel comfortable saying that out loud. I feel comfortable being recognized. There are a lot of trans people who are still scared because it's not always accepting where they're usually handling situations. So I think the best practice, if you don't know, is to always assume that you don't know somebody's gender, regardless of how you see them. Mm-hmm. Again, gender expression looks all kinds of ways. Somebody may look like what you think is a girl to you, but they may identify as he, transgender, non-binary. We just never can assume. So first practice is introducing yourself with your pronouns as cis people, and also making sure that other people are acknowledging others by their pronouns as well.
Yeah. And I would say too, like, because about if someone corrects you, so if you're listening and you misgender someone, so to misgender means to use like the incorrect pronouns or the pronouns that the person does not use. So, and I've had this happen at work and with my students, and I'm getting used to it, but it's never not fun. It's never fun. It's always like an issue. But one thing, and I forgot where I originally saw this, because I feel like I saw it on a graphic on Instagram from like a queer or trans organization. But if someone corrects you with their pronouns and say, actually I go by they, the last thing you want to do is say, I'm sorry, because then you are kind of putting the person you misgendered in the position to say, it's okay that you misgendered me. And that can cause more harm and can be triggering for folks, right? So I think what I've seen folks say and do is to say thank you if someone corrects you with their proper pronouns, because then it's like you're taking responsibility rather than putting the labor or the emotional labor on the person you misgendered to have to like not only like correct you, but then have to make you feel better about insults, being offensive or insulting. And every person's different, right? I think that's the thing too. Like, I know folks who say, you can call me any pronoun and I will be fine. Like, I won't get offended. Or some people have specific ones, right? Or where it's contextual, like who you allow to use certain pronouns, right? Like I don't, because I haven't had like in-depth convo with my parents about that still, like I don't really get bothered if they use he with me, but with everyone else, I'm like, no, you're gonna call me they.
Call me by my they.
Yeah. So yeah. So I think that's something to think about if you're like, well, how can I be better? And the thing is too, like, if you met, people will mess up, right? But I think just correcting yourself, if you catch yourself midway doing it, I think is better than making a big deal of like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. You know what I mean? Just self-correct, like, and keep it pushing. Like,
and as you introduce yourself to, again, making a practice as cis people, it's really important that in spaces, even though everybody might also be cis, that's why it's more important, because cis people are going out in the world and projecting assumptions based on their binary genders. Yeah. And that's what makes it unsafe for trans people. That's what makes it so common that trans people and non-binary people are misgendered, because cis people who have a dominance in the world and the vocabulary that gets used continue to use the wrong vocabulary. So as cis people, if you want to be an ally, always introduce yourself with your pronoun, or in your email signature, put your pronoun. Just make it regular that people are using it, and then it'll be like common knowledge. When somebody tells you theirs, it'll be easier to remember.
Yeah. I was gonna say, when I teach, I usually put it in my name on Zoom, but I was running late today, so so I figured we're going to talk about it anyway.
You know, you mentioned a little bit, Victor, how even just as cis people ensuring that we use our pronouns helps to kind of chip away at the dangers that folks are facing. And now that we kind of have like, you know, the glossary down and understanding of like the language, I think it's important for us to really acknowledge before we continue the conversation why we had decided to have this conversation and the realities of the violence that trans women of color experience on a daily basis, and how, you know, when we talk about misgendering somebody, it may seem like, oh, it's a slip up, I'm just learning, but how that is a piece of this huge system that can really start, you know, making the difference. And when you don't do that, there's so much at stake for people who don't have that privilege. So both of you obviously are on your own journeys. Obviously, you're two different individual people, but if you each can talk a little bit about some folks that have influenced you as queer icons in your kind of your gender journey, you know, folks that may have sparked curiosity, folks that maybe have showed, you know, something different than what's normalized in terms of gender roles or identity, just some influences.
Yeah, I was actually just, I was texting with Victor the other day because something that they had shared sparked a memory for me that I had kind of almost forgotten about. And maybe as you remember, I don't know if you know this, but so one of like my earliest experiences of seeing a drag queen, and I say drag queen because it was like the first time maybe that I was conscious that there was something happening in terms of gender that was not, I mean, I didn't know it was gender at that age, but it was like something associated with gender that was not what I was used to, right? And so when I was a kid, my mom or my family, they were big Gloria Estefan fans. They would always be playing her music. And I remember we went to the store and they had a VHS of like her greatest hits music videos on VHS. And like I begged my parents to get it because I was like, I need this, I need to watch. And yeah, and so I remember watching it, and for one of the videos, it's a song called Everlasting Love, which is an old song from the 50s that she does a cover of. And the video is actually just several different drag queens doing like iconic Gloria Estefan looks from that time, like 80s or early 90s. Because apparently she was pregnant when that song came out, so she couldn't perform or be on screen, and so she had all these drag queens do it. And I remember when I first saw it, I wasn't sure what I was watching. I was like, oh, these people are like impersonators, like, you know. And then I think as I like watched it more as I got older or whatever, it was like, oh no, those are drag queens. Like they're that's the whole vibe here. And then there's like this like really campy moment towards the end where they're like walking down a catwalk and start like pushing each other off which I was like, why does it always have to be like queens like pushing each other off a stage? But anyway, so I think that was like one of the, and I just was like a huge, and I'll talk more after, but like about like my love for pop divas and I think how that also has informed, or that was informed a lot of, I think, how I saw myself, but not able to kind of understand it as non-binary until, you know, I was a full ass adult. So I'll go there so we can maybe go back and forth. So I'll pass it over to you, Victor.
There's so many people come to mind, but I'm going to speak specifically probably about, I mean, obviously about people who like resonated with me like in an intersectional way where I was like, this person, because I saw a lot of queer people on TV, they were usually white or they, you know, and so I felt something different, but when I saw queer people who shared my experience and my language and my culture, that's when I was like, wait, so I exist, but I exist like in a specific space. Like I mean, now I can realize that as a kid, I was more like, I'm really drawn to this and specifically to these people. And one of them was Walter Mercado. Obviously, my grandparents would watch as he identified as he, right? But I really believe that they were one of the first like non-binary, gender non-conforming people that I was so amazed by because they had this brilliance and this like theatrical nature that I felt like so drawn to wanting to do but felt shamed for. But I saw people in my family, like even people who I feel like shamed me for the same behavior, like really look and idolize people like Walter Mercado and people like Juan Gabriel. And there's just so many instances of these queer people who were assigned male at birth, who I think were more fluid in their expression. And even my grandmother, the same grandmother who listened and who watched, had a hairdresser who was queer, and I feel like very gender fluid as well in their expression. It was always hard for me to tell because as a queer person, you usually saw this is back in 1995, 96, you saw like either someone who was really gay or someone who was super feminine, like a woman, basically transitioning to be a woman. And there was so the space in between is where I always felt as a non-binary person, like I don't necessarily see myself as a gay male. It's not about my sexuality, who I'm attracted to. It's about like what I feel like I am. And I don't feel like a complete woman. I don't want to be my sister, but I feel really attracted to these fluid characters. So those three, like my grandmother's hairdresser and Walter Mercado and Juan Gabriel, were like three that I remember, like something about them is like, I just really drawn to this. And they also speak my language and I can like sing to the song or like listen to what they're saying. And it felt like a secret because all my friends are all people I knew who didn't speak Spanish. Like I was like, I have this special token of these people who are like the first relics for me of being queer. So those are some of my very early ones.
Now, that's funny because like our grandma, our Chilean grandma, Vero, is obsessed, has always been with Juan Gabriel. But it was funny because she would almost talk about him as if like she had like a crush on him, like in addition to just like loving his music and his songs. And I remember, again, as a kid, not really knowing all of that or what it meant, but being like, you have a crush on him? like you do? Not because he is not, because yes, not because it's not attractive, but it's just like, it didn't seem like the other men who were on TV that I would hear, it was my mom or my tias saying like they found was handsome or whatever.
Yeah.
And if anything, I would remember hearing things like, what's the word that they would use? But kind of implying like, oh, he's a little funny whenever they say that, you know what I mean? Or I don't know what the translation is. There's a specific word. But it's kind of like queer, right? Like it's like, oh, he's a little queer, he's a little funny, there's a little swish, right, in his step, how they say. So
it was always othered. That's that's why now I can look back at my childhood heroes and like really idolize and romanticize and love them without shame. But then it was like being drawn to these characters, but also hearing the way that people talked about them, like in a way that shamed them or othered them, which is what happens with trans people. And specifically within the Latino community, it's very like, not my child. Like I love it as a performer, I love it as this person who's on TV portraying something, but when it comes to being real, let me make a difference in saying that like we shame this is other, that there's something funny about them. So growing up not understanding why all this different language is being used or why we idolize some people sometimes and shamed other people in private, it is really confusing as a trans and non-binary person growing up, because you don't have a clear like binary or viewpoint from where you see the world the way that cis people do. They know who looks like them, they know who they see on TV, and for trans and non-binary kids to grow up, it's very scary because you don't know who you can see as an example that's a successful person. So that's something that I think I'm learning now as an adult to kind of heal through a lot of that pain that I felt as a child.
I'm just like, I'm like listening because I'm like, I feel. In the same way of like, it was something that I felt at that age, being 5 years old, 6 years old, 10 years old, but I could never, and it wasn't until at 31 that I was actually like finally putting words to it and being like, oh, actually that's me. Like I'm talking about myself when I say this is what non-binary is, or this is what trans is, or whatever. And I think I don't remember if I talked about this at the Mi Primo Marica. Maybe I did. I feel like I've shared it somewhere, but I have a memory of us living at our old house, where we lived in South Whittier before we moved here. And my dad used to have those big ass video cameras, like the one that you put on like your shoulder with the full on tape. And we had learned how to connect it to the TV so that we could record ourselves while and then like we'd be on the screen, and we thought it was the coolest thing. And Yaz and I would be making like music videos and dancing, and I remember we were dancing to Selena. It was on Amor Prohibido album, and it was Una Vez, because that song is probably one of my favorite Selena songs. And Yaz and I were on our own. So I must have been what, like 7 or 8, and you were like 4, something like that. And so we did our little show, whatever. And then I think later we were like, oh, we were going to show my parents, like, here, look at this like little performance that we did. And they were like, oh, it's so cute. And they're going for it. And Yaz is cute with her little curls and dancing around. And then I remember watching myself on the screen afterward. And it was like where you're like outside of yourself and then you witness it happen, because I was like, oh, wow. Like I'm being very, like in my mind being like, you're being like a girl in how you're dancing. And it was, Una Vez has that kind of like flamenco like vibe going. And I remember just being like very like regal in my mind. And then like watching it and being like, oh, like this is, and watching it and then like turning over to see what my parents' reaction was. And I caught them, like they didn't say anything, but I caught them give each other a look. And so it was all of this like nonverbal, like these like dialogues happening non-verbally between, me and the screen of my parents. And I just always remember that, because it was like, I think that was one of the most stark memories of like learning gender socialization without being told you can't do this because it's X, right? Or for whatever reason. It was just like all a look.
Also feelings of shame, right? Like just if they didn't even have to say anything to you, but just like socialization itself, like you already knew, for some reason you knew that that was something that you could get in trouble for, or like you might be disappointing someone or feeling shame for.
Right.
How like tiny, right, that nonverbal cue was, but that made such a huge impact.
And there probably was other situations like that, but that one, for whatever reason, is like where my mind goes when I think of what that, know. There's other things too, like don't sit with your legs crossed, because boys don't do that, or don't scream like a woman.
Don't pee sitting down, like ridiculous things that as a kid I was just like, wait, I really find all of the natural things that I wanted to do. Like I wanted to be more fluid with my body. I wanted to yell with a higher pitch. Like I was shamed literally by my family members saying, don't do that because it makes you, that's what girls do. Yeah. And me feeling I am not a girl, but I feel like not a boy. So what does that mean for me? Because you're telling me things that I don't resonate with. And I'm seeing examples that are closer to maybe what feels like more freeing to me, but it's that shame. Like I said, they're very small instances and things that we still do now with children and kids and socializing and rewarding them for displaying specific gender expressions as little boys or little girls, who they interact with, what toys they play with, who they idolize. If we see them playing with these toys, we are going to pivot them. These are natural inclinations that children have that don't have any shame, and then we attach shame when we're directing them to what, as parents, we think is the best option based on how we've been socialized. So
projecting much.
So, I mean, you talk a lot about the children, right? Like, what about the children? So imagining what the future might look like, and imagining what, children 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now might experience, like what do you all either hope for, or what do you all see as like the future of gender?
Oof. Do you want to, I can't see your face.
I'm like, we need a seance first.
Right. I was like, all I hear is Whitney singing, I believe the children of the future.
Oh my gosh.
Because for sure, both of you right now are, in being your authentic selves, are now being the people that younger folks might look at as who you wished you may have been able to know, right? And through social media, younger folks have access, or people are able to see other people, even if they're not in their exact, physical community, like they can see you all.
Well, like in a general sense, like my ideal or my hope for gender is that it's abolished completely. Not completely. that the system of gender, the binary system of gender that we have currently is abolished, is what I should say, because gender can be everything, right? And the children are the future thing is kind of what we've seen historically be used for, like, why people were against same-sex marriage before, because it was a threat to the nuclear family, or the sanctity of marriage, or the fact that LGBT folks historically have been criminalized for their sexual behavior, but also for being considered sexual deviants, right? And being equated with being like pedophiles and predators. And so in a similar sense too, like all the things that we see now with attacks on like transgender bathroom bills and the discrimination that trans kids are experiencing across the country, like every state and in schools for choosing to live and exist as their true gender identity, even if they're as young as like 9 years old, right? Or even younger in some cases. And so, I think on the side of like the right and the conservative voices, and even in the liberal voices too, of how they talk about gender, right? And like that LGBT issues are like somehow gay men's, like gay men's issues are representative of what the LGBT rainbow is supposed to encompass. And so I think to do that, like, and so if that's what exists, right, to imagine a different world or a different future, is to like start with what we've been saying, right? The pronoun things, like making gender education part of the curriculum for K through 12 at every stage, so that they have a language for it at 5 years old, at 6 years old, right? And I think when you open up the door to stuff like that, it's like you also open up the conversation to teach kids about consent, and not just sexual consent, but like consent about physical boundaries for themselves with their bodies, and maybe not wanting to hug people or kiss older relatives, you know what I mean? Like all of those things that we're just kind of assumed are like happening at home and at school in terms of how you're teaching kids, right, behaviorally. And it leaves out all of these other things that we've been talking about, so that, when as the child is growing up and, through adolescence and beyond, like if there's not a space being created either at school or at home for them to feel like they can be who they are, right? Like that's, to me, what's worrisome. Like that's what makes me feel bleak, like, or that makes the future look bleak if we're not attending to that, if we're not addressing that, like structurally, interpersonally, like in our local communities, like our workplace. So and I think that, like, you also do that, like I'm thinking about it like legislatively, but like also through art, right? And performance and music and artists and fashion and I always think of like you, Victor, as like someone too. I'm always like on Instagram, like every look slaying the house down, like. And I think, like for me, it's like I've never really explored that as heavily before, and so I always see you as like someone. I'm like, yes, that's like, they're doing it. They got it. And so I think that there's room for, like incorporating that into how we teach kids about gender, so they can see that there is a wide spectrum, right, of how they can express themselves and exist and be in the world. So,
Victor?
Yeah. Seb touched on so many great points
right.
that I'll like add on to, but everything that's, first of all, it's so sweet of you to say, because the way that you speak about me is like, as a trans person, like the way you want to be spoken about, the way you want people to recognize you. So every time I hear it, even now, it's still difficult for me to say like I accept that, because I'm still feeling challenged to believe that about myself. So the more we hear things, this is called an affirmation for everybody listening. When we affirm people in their gender and their expression of who they are, we're building a world where we're saying this other, like everything that Seb touched on, in regards to politics or society or how we condition children, trans, gay, LGBTQ, queer, everything is seen as other, as a different reference point, because the starting point is always straight, cis, white, male. So queerness, transness, all of these things operate under the same system, which is why the intersectionality is really important in understanding. Some people don't have the education at home and their parents don't understand what this is. So why isn't it a part of curriculum? Why isn't society, those of us who do know and who have the access to information and learning more, why aren't we creating a world every day that visibly reflects the best parts of who these children are, who maybe are in different circumstances? If you're at the intersection of being undocumented, your parents probably, their priorities are probably not pronouns and raising transgender children, understanding that. So it shouldn't fall on that child to have an experience that fails them. It should be up to cis people who have, all of us, you know, who have a commitment to trans people and to anybody, to our children, our future, that there is a world that's possible other than the one that we've been told, which is that it is cis, that it is straight, that that is normal. And every law that we pass, everything is like, because those things that are other and that are not normal, we need to regulate, because what they're doing is infiltrating our kids and making other things possible. But it's also everyday understanding there are lots of possibilities that we don't know about. And the more intersections that you're at, the more marginalization that you feel, the more things feel impossible. So as cis people, I ask that everyone show their allyship by really challenging themselves to understand how every day, not just in my language and my pronouns, how am I perpetuating these gender constructs that maybe there's people around me who are feeling kind of suppressed by that I feel this way, that maybe don't feel safe to come to me. And I think a lot of people feel like we would love the people in our family and our friend circles no matter what, but we aren't always adopting the kind of behavior that enables a safe space for those people to be who they are fully until they're adults, when they come into their own, similar to Seb and I, where I'm like, I've done a lot of internal work that now I feel like if this person misgenders me, if my family members aren't ready for me, I'm in a place for myself where I can overcome that. But not everyone is in that space, and not everyone should wait until they're 30 years old for that to happen. Kids should start to have that world and grow into that the way that their cis counterparts do. So that's just a little bit of what I have to say about racism.
Amen to that.
Well, you know, if by now you don't realize how violent a gender reveal party is, I don't know what you need, sis.
Yeah.
I know, I'm like,
but let's get it together. So final thoughts, you know, reflection, PSA, you know, both of you just drove home the importance of how we treat the children in our communities. So do we have PSAs for folks with children or who are raising children?
There you go. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so don't do gender reveal parties. Don't be basic and burn down all of California. That's horrible. A true example, symbolic of how toxic gender binaries and patriarchy are. I would say with folks who have children in their lives that they spend time with and are raising and mentoring, especially with like young babies to like toddlers, commenting on their physical appearance as being somehow indicative that they're going to get the ladies if they're a baby boy, or, you know, have all the guys chasing them if they're baby girls or whatever, is gross for so many reasons. One, because you are sexualizing babies, even in a future tense, right? Like you're sexualizing them for the future. And you're making a whole lot of assumptions of who they're going to be attracted to, how they're going to identify. And you may think it's like a funny, like, oh no, joke, or it's just something that people say, but like you are teaching so much to that child by making a comment that you think is like, you know, just like a passing kind of whatever comment. Because it's information, right? The child is reading like, okay, I can only like girls, and I, you know, have to have many girls chasing me, and like there's a specific way that like proper a proper way of performing and expressing desire. Like that's so weird to me, you know what I mean? Like, and that parents don't think twice about saying stuff like that, right? So I think that's one thing for folks with kids, to be more cognizant of when you're with them.
My one PSA is a challenge that I met with a lot, because I'm somebody who's a little more radical and outspoken when I see this happening with parents and children. I will step in because I was the kid. So you don't have to be a parent to understand the harm of that language. I think that to be a parent is to be open and understanding other experiences for your child. There's no way for you to know what your child's going to be like or be interested in. You do shape their world, so your language really matters. But what I do come upon when I have these conversations, which happens a lot because there's a lot of people at my age having babies and revealing their gender and saying like, well, what am I supposed to do? This is how the world is. First of all, that is not a good excuse for you to act this way. But secondly, really thinking about, it's not about getting it right. What cis people need to do is start getting comfortable with being uncomfortable about their complexity. As human beings, we're extremely complex. Gender is extremely complex. I don't expect every parent or anybody to know, even myself, to know everything there is to know about gender and my feelings. It will evolve as I evolve, as your children will. So it's understanding I will be wrong. And as a parent, it's not about being right and doing the right thing all the time. My aim is, my intention is right. I'm doing the most that I can, and I'm making the most possible. But I will be wrong. And when I'm wrong, I am willing to be confronted and be held accountable and do what's right and do what my child is saying. So if you raise your child assigned male at birth as a male, understand if they grow up and show different tendencies than what you are used to or what you expect of them, that you allow them to explore that and to be that without stepping in to shame them or redirect them. And if you feel maybe part of that was your fault in realizing your pattern of behavior, stepping in and saying, I may have done this in the past with you, my child, but now you tell me what it is that you feel. You tell me what these things are that you like so that I can learn as a parent. It's not about parenting our children to become someone. It's about letting our children be the person that they are with us as their guides. I really think that that's what would help in creating a trans progressive future for children, is parents knowing that possibility exists and allowing themselves to be wrong.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like imagine a future where folks that weren't okay with that, just not being okay with having kids. Like if you're choosing to have children and to be a parent where you're now responsible for, raising a human being, and this like idea of unconditional love, right? That a lot of, parents and families share with their children, but still have conditions. So like if you're going to be conditional, don't have children.
Yeah.
Like imagine a thought,
There's the PSA.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, this was a very beautiful, fruitful conversation. I definitely learned a lot. I hope listeners, you are, asking questions or Googling things, because we also invite you to Google to learn more. There's so many articles. Make sure they're articles from sources that you would trust. But we definitely, invite you to explore a lot more of these topics if this is something that's new to you. And if you have questions, email us at cafeconchisme@gmail.com, and hopefully we can get back to all of the questions that you may have. But I think this brings us to the conclusion of this episode. Thank you so much, Victor, for joining us. It has been such a pleasure.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. I'm so excited to be a part of this and talk about these things that are really important. So thank you for having me.
And if folks want to check out Victor's page, it's Victor Go, right? Just one.
Victor Go. Go Victor Go. Go Victor.
Oh, sorry. There you go. Awesome. Well, you can check them out there. I'm going to echo yes. Thank you so much, Victor. And I feel like we should do this again.
I would love to anytime.
Awesome.
All right, folks. Well, every day and every way, you are getting better and better.
And remember that you know more than you think you know.
Bye, folks.
Bye.